In normal situations, the entire economy of a country is primarily oriented to create wealth and meet the demand for people's goods and services. But what happens when things change and suddenly some extraordinary event takes on an exorbitant relevance? Think, for example, of a pandemic like the one we're now experiencing with coronavirus, or alternatively, a war. As you can imagine, in these kinds of situations, the priorities of people, and also of governments, can change radically overnight. And with that change comes a shift in the needs of production. Suddenly, demand changes, and you have to produce very different things as quickly as possible. In the case of a pandemic, medical equipment, and in the case of a war, all kinds of weapons and ammunition. Well, it's in these situations that you start talking about the war economy. It's a special case scenario that has been put in place in many countries today precisely because of the coronavirus. Now, how can you activate a war economy? What capacity do governments have to steer all domestic production in one direction? How do you manage absolutely extraordinary situations? Well, in this video, we're going to answer all of these questions, and we're going to do it by taking a look back at history, and in particular, the history of the United States. So come with us on a little journey as we explore the history of war economies.
The war machine.
If we want to investigate how a country can speedily transform its productive structure when faced with an extraordinary event, we have to go back to World War II. There we will find the best example of a war economy. And as you'll see, although it may seem incredible to us now that until the first half of the 20th century, the United States was basically a peaceful isolationist country, and on political issues it was practically separated from what went on in the rest of the world. I mean, who would have thought, right? Historically, the United States was not in favor of getting into other people's arguments because it was an activity that involved many sacrifices and cost a lot of money. That is precisely why, practically until the early 20th century, with the exception of some very particular actions, the United States was regarded as a neutral country, a non-interventionalist foreign policy country. Let us say that during that time, the libertarian principles of the Founding Fathers still governed US politics. However, with the advent of the 20th century, all this gradually began to change, and the United States began to have an increasingly important international presence. At first, the essential objective was to ensure trading security, but over time, as we all know, political issues began to take on more and more importance. This new role led them, for example, to participate in World War I against the German Empire, and years later in the Second World War, but this time it was for very different reasons. In this case, it was the Japanese Empire, with the infamous attack on Pearl Harbor, that literally pushed the United States into war. We could say that the Pearl Harbor attack was one of those events that helped change the course of history. In the attack on December 7th, 1941, the United States not only lost more than 2,400 citizens, but also much of its Pacific Fleet. The attack resulted in 8 sunken ships and another 11 with damage to varying degrees. It's the largest military attack the United States has ever received on its own territory.
The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
This event brought the country swiftly into World War II, and with that, it radically changed the way Americans lived and produced goods almost overnight. Suddenly, all industry in the country was put at the service of the army and the state. But it was not by chance. It was coordinated through an agency created by President Roosevelt himself, the War Production Board, which was established on January 16th, 1942, a few weeks after the Japanese attack. Now the question is, what good did this meeting really do? Among other things, this board coordinated the transformation of civil industry in such a way that any factory that had the capacity to do so immediately got to work on adapting itself to the production of all kinds of military equipment. Weapons, vehicles, tanks, ammunition, staffing equipment, etc., etc. A good example is in the automotive industry. Here, the change was radical. While some 3 million vehicles were produced in the United States in 1941, in 1943, that dropped dramatically to only 139. Yep, that's right, only 139 civilian vehicles were manufactured in an entire year. And in 1944, just 610, which is less than 1,000 cars in 2 years. Of course, throughout World War II, American industry worked on a piecework basis, and by 1945, half of the planet's entire industrial production was in the United States. This was something that was vital to subsequent events, because for the duration of World War II, all of America's industrial power focused on a single mission: winning the war.
Time to make planes and more planes, bombers and fighters.
In this way, the automotive industry began the bulk manufacturing of tanks, trucks, firearms, and aircraft engines. In fact, Detroit factories began to show images as unusual as this. Factories full of tanks, ready to send to the front line. But this wasn't the only change. Industrial production demanded more and more labor, and of course, as many healthy, working-aged men were recruited as soldiers, millions of women who had previously stayed at home, along with much of the black population that at that time had been marginalized to menial roles, were put to work in the automotive industry. It was not only an economic change, but a real social transformation began. The most paradoxical thing of all is that during this entire period in which the War Production Board was in force, the US economy functioned largely as a socialist economy. Yes, private initiative was maintained, but the main decisions were taken centrally. Ultimately, it was the federal government that decided how to distribute raw materials, what industries were distributed to, where investments were made, and even what was manufactured and in what quantity. There were also rationing measures and price controls imposed on the entire population. In short, virtually the entire economy became controlled by the state and put at the service of the needs of military campaigns. Of course, all of this had consequences. The cost of the war was so high due to the gigantic debt-financed injection of public spending that in 1945, at the end of the war, public debt had increased fivefold from the time the US entered the war. And that was despite the Income Act of 1942, which increased the number of taxpayers who had to pay taxes from 13 million to 50 million people, almost 4 times more tax revenue. And I know what you might be thinking. Oh, come on, Simon. I mean, it all works out wonderfully, didn't it? Well, yeah, it did, but also no. Make no mistake, the key was not in the production board, but in the enormous industrial superiority that the United States had achieved during the preceding years. So, this board never expropriated the assets or means of production from the companies. What it did in the face of an absolutely extreme situation was simply to coordinate them with one goal: to replace production for society with a much more concrete production: war production. However, this was not the only time the United States put in place such measures. Does 1950 ring any bells? Well, yes, I'm sure many of you have guessed it. The Korean War, a long and hard conflict that took place between 1950 and 1953. It pitted the communist bloc of North Korea and China against the bloc of South Korea, the United States, and many other countries that acted under the mandate of the United Nations. It was a new war, a bitter war, just a few years after the end of World War I. This was clearly a new effort that required extraordinary action. In this case, President Truman promoted the Defense Production Act of 1950. This law was a kind of sequel to the World War II Production Board, but with some differences. Under this law, instead of the government directly managing production and controlling prices, what it did primarily was to prioritize US government contracts above everyone else. That is, if the government asked for something, it took precedence over any other client. There was also the ability to order an expansion in production of certain products or individual changes to production lines. But the most curious thing about this law is that to a large extent it is still in force today, and also that its use has been nothing exceptional. In fact, the powers emanating from this act in one form are used by the Defense Department to place nearly 300,000 orders each year. And it's not just about the Department of Defense. For example, according to a report by the US Congress, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA, used it more than 1,000 times during 2018. This is why it should come as no surprise that in a situation as serious as the one we're currently dealing with coronavirus, the federal government has used the powers of this act. So let's take a look.
The war against the invisible enemy.
If there's one thing that's bringing together presidents around the world, it's the rhetoric they're employing in the fight against coronavirus.
Nous sommes en guerre sanitaire, certes.
Transmito este mensaje, por supuesto, con la prudencia exigible en medio de una guerra nunca antes librada.
We're at war. In a true sense, we're at war, and we're fighting an invisible enemy.
Now, many people have criticized the use of these terms to refer to a battle that is, after all, a healthcare issue. But what if it's really not that different from a state of war? After all, from a productive and economic standpoint, we could almost go so far as to say that this is a war in its purest sense. As we've already mentioned, quarantine and mandatory confinement measures are causing unprecedented economic havoc. In fact, the International Monetary Fund is already talking about the biggest economic downturn since the crash of 1929.
IMF predicts worst downturn since the Great Depression. The New York Times.
It's something I'm sure will come as no surprise. If people don't leave the house and can't even work, it makes sense that all production, consumption, and investments could collapse, at least for a while. And this scenario is, in fact, the closest thing to a war that many of us have probably experienced in our lives. It is precisely for this reason, and with the aim of ensuring that production focuses on equipping health workers with materials in order to protect themselves and save lives, that extraordinary measures have been put in place. In some cases, these measures are very reminiscent of those adopted in the past. For example, President Donald Trump, after some reluctance and many delays, eventually resorted to activating the Defense Production Act created during the Korean War. By the way, notice how the White House has pivoted on this issue. This quote refers to the application of this law, which the president enabled on March the 22nd, 2020.
We're a country not based on nationalizing our business. Call a person over in Venezuela. Ask them how did nationalization of their businesses work out. Not too well. President Trump.
Of course, the law doesn't talk about nationalization, but, well, you know how Trump is. The point is, just a few days later, in the face of the dire shortage of existing healthcare material and respirators, we find a news story like this.
Trump issues order under Defense Production Act to secure more ventilators. The Wall Street Journal.
Under this order, companies such as General Motors, which, as you all know, is dedicated to making cars, was forced to change their production and start manufacturing respirators as soon as possible. And the question is, why did Trump, despite his initial opposition, decide to resort to such a drastic measure? Well, that's because of news headlines like this.
New Jersey issues guide on which patients should get ventilators. Bloomberg.
The shortage of respirators leads to the selection of patients who can access them and be treated with one. That is, it basically forces you to determine who lives and who dies. And the Trump administration's lack of action in coordinating the health response has been one of the main accusations thrown at the president.
President said it's a war. It is a war. Well then act like it's a war. Only the federal government has that power, and to not exercise that power is inexplicable to me. I do not for the life of me understand the reluctance to use the Federal Defense Production Act. Andrew Cuomo, New York governor.
And it seems that the US administration is still not being very agile.
Trump hasn't ordered any ventilators from GM, despite saying he was using wartime powers to force production. Nearly a week after invoking his powers under Korean-era law, President Donald Trump's administration has not formally ordered any of the machines. USA Today.
But we talked about all this a short time ago in another video. In case you haven't seen it, I'll leave a link on screen now as well as in the description. So that, in a nutshell, is what is known as a war economy, when suddenly measures are taken so that the production system focuses on meeting a certain need above any other. So far, in the face of this coronavirus crisis, it seems that the Trump administration has decided not to pursue a war economy scenario beyond any individual cases. And the question is, should it be? Wouldn't it be better to use market criteria, such as a public supply competition or generously remunerated orders? Can a country today overcome a crisis by isolating itself from the rest of the world? Is state bureaucracy going to be fast enough to be effective? These are the questions that are asked by those who do not favor starting such initiatives. And the fact is that, for example, in Spain, companies have acted more effectively and more swiftly than the government itself. But in any case, here's the question, the big question. Should governments be declaring and implementing a war economy, as, for example, the United States did during World War II or the Korean War? Well, leave your answers in the comments, and I really do hope you enjoyed this video. Please do hit that like button if you did, and don't forget to subscribe for brand new videos. Also, please do check out our friends at the Reconsider Media podcast. They provided the vocals in this episode that were not mine. Also, this channel is possible because of Patreon and our patrons on that platform. Please consider joining them and supporting our mission of providing independent political coverage. And as always, I'll see you in the next video.
And if you want to learn more about politics and hear even more of my lovely voice, you can join us at Reconsider Media. We have a podcast at reconsidermedia.com/podcast. See you there.